There was a woman in Colton's Bluff who people said would be dead or begging within a month. Her name was Eliza Crane. Though most folks in that town never bothered to learn it, we want you to sit with that for a moment. Because what happened to Eliza in the spring of 1887 didn't start with a discovery or a treasure or a courtroom moment that made grown men go quiet. It started with a locked door and a notice nailed to the wood that read, "Property seized, debt unpaid, by order of Colton's Bluff County." Eliza Vane was 22 years old when she stood on the porch of her late father's cooperative, the barrel-making shop he had built board by board over 30 years, and read that notice twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something she could live with. They didn't. Her father, Edmund Vane, had died of a fever the previous November. He had not been a wealthy man, but he had been an honest one, and the cooperative had been enough. Enough for the two of them, enough for winter, enough to call home. Edmund Vane had also been a man who trusted people too easily. Specifically, he had trusted his brother. Silas Vane held the note on the shop. He had lent Edmund money 4 years prior, during a dry summer when barrel orders ran thin, and Edmund, being the kind of man who shook hands instead of signing papers, had believed his brother's word when Silas said, "Pay me back when you can, no rush." No rush became no mercy the moment Edmund was in the ground. Silas arrived in Colton's Bluff within 2 weeks of the funeral, well-dressed and carrying papers that looked official enough to make the county clerk nod along without asking too many questions. The cooperative, the tools, the finished barrels stacked along the south wall, all of it seized. Eliza was left with a carpet bag, a change of clothes, and the one thing Silas hadn't seen fit to claim: a worn leather satchel that had belonged to her father's old master craftsman, a barrel-maker named Thomas Birch, who had taught Edmund the trade 40 years prior and had, at the end of his life, sent the satchel along to Edmund with a note saying, "Keep what's useful." Inside the satchel was a crow's plane, a specialized tool for cutting the groove in a barrel that holds the head in place. It was old, the iron dark with use, the wooden body smooth where hands had gripped it 10,000 times. Eliza had learned to use it at her father's elbow. She could do the work, she knew the trade. What she didn't have was a shop, or an order, or anywhere to go. She spent the first 2 nights sleeping in the loft of the livery stable at the edge of town, paying for the space by mucking stalls at dawn, before anyone was awake to see her. On the 3rd morning, the stable hand, a teenage boy named Roy, told her, not unkindly, that his employer would be back from Abilene by Friday and he couldn't keep covering for her. "There's nothing else in town?" she asked. Roy thought for a moment. "There's the Delwood place, out on the old mill road." He paused. "But nobody goes there." "Why not?" "Because it's been sitting empty since old Delwood drowned in the creek. Place is half collapsed. Silas Vane owns it now, actually. Bought it off the estate for almost nothing. Says he's going to tear it down and sell the timber." Roy looked at her sideways. "You're not thinking about going out there." "I'm not thinking anything," Eliza said. "I'm just asking." She walked out to the Delwood place that same afternoon. It was worse than Roy had made it sound. The roof of the main house had caved in on one side, and the porch had rotted through in 2 places. There was a well that smelled like rust and mud. The outbuilding, what had once been a small mill workshop, was still standing barely, one of its walls leaning outward at an angle that would eventually become a collapse. But there was a workbench inside, and the floor was solid oak plank, and the light through the broken shutters came in at the angle of late afternoon, in a way that reminded Eliza so precisely of her father's cooperative that she had to set her hand against the doorframe and wait for the feeling to pass. She went back to town and spent the last of her money, $4.60, on a padlock, a length of rope, a box of nails, and 3 pounds of salt pork. Then she went back to the Delwood place and did not leave. The first week was about survival. She patched the lean in the workshop wall, with timber she pulled from the collapsed section of the main house, working by feel in the dim light because she couldn't afford lamp oil. She ate the salt pork cold. She drank from the well after cleaning it out as best she could with a bucket and a rag. Nobody came to bother her. Nobody noticed her at all. That, she would later say, was both the hardest and the most useful thing about those first weeks. Invisibility can break a person, or it can buy them time. Eliza used the time. Her father had done occasional repair work for the local cooperative guild and for individual farmers who needed barrels mended rather than bought new. She knew there was demand for that kind of work in Colton's Bluff. She had heard the complaints often enough, the farmers grumbling that the nearest proper cooperative was now in the next county, that getting a barrel rehooped or a cracked stave replaced meant either a long trip or waiting until someone came through. She also knew that showing up in town with her name and her father's trade would get her exactly two things: questions about the cooperage and a visit from Silas Vane's lawyer. So she didn't announce herself. She simply appeared. She approached the first farmer at his gate, a man named Aldous Burkett, whose name she had heard her father mention as someone with a standing order for flour barrels every season. She introduced herself as a cooper passing through. She did not give her last name. She quoted him a price for rehooping 6 barrels that was half what he'd been paying to ship them to the county seat, shook his hand, and came back the next morning with the crow's plane and a hammer she'd traded a half-day of fence work to obtain. Aldous Burkett watched her work for about 10 minutes. Then he went inside and brought out a glass of water without being asked, set it on the fence post near her, and didn't say another word until she was done. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked. "My father," she said. "He any good?" "He was the best I ever saw." Aldous Burkett nodded slowly. "You're better than the man we had before. I've got a neighbor, Harlan Oakes, whose entire cellar stock is in barrels that are all going soft at the head. He's been complaining about it for 2 months. "I'd be glad to take a look," Eliza said. Within 3 weeks, she had 6 regular customers. Within 5, she had 9. She was still sleeping on the workbench she'd padded with burlap sacks, still eating mostly what she was paid in trade. Dried beans, cornmeal, a sack of apples from one grateful farmer, but she was working every day, and the work was good, and she was building something. And then Silas Vane found out. We'd like to say it came as a surprise, but it didn't. Colton's Bluff was a small town, and small towns talk. What surprised Eliza was not that he found out, but how quickly he moved. He arrived at the Delwood property on a Tuesday morning in May, accompanied by a man named Reverend Aldrich Pell. Not a reverend in any formal sense as far as anyone could tell, but a man who had arrived in Colton's Bluff 6 years prior and attached himself to every legal and financial transaction in the county with the patient persistence of a barnacle. Pell handled Silas Vane's business arrangements. He was the one who had drawn up the papers on the cooperage. "You're trespassing," Silas said, standing at the workshop door. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Eliza had noticed that about him at her father's funeral, how quiet he was, how reasonable he sounded even when he was taking everything. "This land isn't posted," Eliza said. She was standing at the workbench with a barrel stave in her hands, and she did not put it down. "It's my land. I don't need to post it." Silas looked around the workshop with the mild, appraising look of a man calculating timber value. "You've done some work here. Pell, note that down. She's modified the structure without permission, which constitutes further damage to the property." Pell was already writing in a small leather notebook. "I shored up the wall," Eliza said. "It was going to fall. That's not for you to decide." Silas looked at her finally, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, not softened, just recalibrated. "I'm not a cruel man, Eliza. You were in a difficult situation. But you cannot simply take up residence on land that belongs to someone else." "What do you want?" she asked. "I want you gone by Friday, and I want the workbench. That's Delwood's workbench, which means it's mine, and I'll want the tools. Whatever you've accumulated here, the tools are mine. Prove it." She said nothing. Silas Vane nodded as if she had confirmed something. "Friday," he said, and left. Pell lingered a moment at the door. He had the look of a man who wanted to say something, and Eliza waited. "For what it's worth," Pell said quietly. "The original note on your father's cooperage, the terms your uncle claims were agreed upon. There are some questions about whether they were ever properly recorded." He glanced toward where Silas had disappeared down the road. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply saying that questions exist." Then he left too. Eliza stood in the workshop for a long time after they were gone. Then she picked up the barrel stave and went back to work. She had 3 days. She would use them. That evening, she walked to the far edge of the Delwood property, where the old Mill Creek ran shallow over flat stones before it curved into the overgrown land beyond the fence line. She had walked this stretch before, looking for timber she might salvage, and she had noticed something in the creek bed that she'd noted, and then set aside because she didn't have the time or the strength to deal with it. It was a wagon, not entirely submerged. The creek was too shallow for that, but lying on its side in the bed of the creek, half buried in 2 years' worth of silt and leaf debris, its canvas long since rotted away, its wheel spokes black with water damage. The wagon had clearly been there for years. Whether it had rolled in by accident or been pushed deliberately, she couldn't say. Most people would have looked at that wagon and seen nothing. Eliza looked at it and saw wood. She didn't decide right away. She went back to the workshop and lay down on the burlap sacks and stared at the ceiling and tried to think practically about what Friday meant. She could leave. She could go to the next town and start over. She had the crow's plane and her skills, and that was enough to begin again somewhere. That Silas Vane's name didn't carry weight. But she thought about what Pell had said. Questions exist. She got up before dawn and went back to the creek. The wagon was heavier than she'd expected. The waterlogged wood had doubled its weight, and the silt had a suction grip on the underside that she had to break loose inch by inch with a salvaged fence post used as a pry bar. She worked for 3 hours before she had it upright in the creek bed, another hour before she had it up on the bank. She sat in the grass and looked at it. It was a freight wagon, the kind used for hauling supplies along the old trading routes before the rail lines came through. The bed was deep, with high sidewalls that had held their shape better than she'd expected, probably because the wood was an old-growth white oak that didn't give up easily even submerged. The undercarriage was damaged but not beyond repair. The wheels would need new spokes, new iron tires, new hubs. She walked around it slowly, the way her father had taught her to look at a piece of work before deciding what it needed. You start with what's there, not what's missing, what's there. The floor of the wagon bed, she noticed, was thicker than it should be. She crouched down and looked at it more closely. The planking was solid, too solid, she thought, too thick for a freight wagon that needed to maximize its load capacity. A freight wagon's floor was usually the thinnest structurally sound plank you could get away with. Extra thickness was extra weight, and extra weight was money. She knocked on the floor with her knuckle. The sound was wrong, not hollow exactly, muffled, like knocking on a door with something stacked behind it. She looked at the edges of the floor planking and saw it then, a line, a seam, running parallel to the sides of the wagon about 4 inches from the edge, all the way around. Not a structural joint, too deliberate for that, and sealed with what looked like pitch that had been painted over to match the surrounding wood. Eliza went back to the workshop and got a pry bar and a mallet. It took her 40 minutes to break the pitch seal around the false floor panel, and another 10 minutes of careful work to lift the panel without splintering it. Underneath were 2 things. The first was a canvas pouch, mildewed but intact, tied shut with cord. When she opened it, she found gold coins, double eagles, most of them the kind used for large transactions. She counted them twice, then a third time. 220 coins. At $20 each, that was $4,400. The second thing was a leather document wallet, much better preserved than the canvas pouch, because leather breathes differently than canvas, and the pitch seal had kept the worst of the moisture out. Inside were 3 folded papers. The first was a bill of lading for a freight shipment, dated 1884, listing cargo as dry goods, Colton's Bluff County warehouse. The second was a handwritten ledger page, dense with figures, itemizing payments made and received over a period of 6 months in 1883 and 1884. The third was a letter. The letter was signed by Aldrich Pell. Eliza read all 3 documents standing in the creek grass with water still on her boots. Then she sat down on the bank and read them again. What they described, taken together, cross-referencing the ledger figures against the bill of lading dates, was a systematic skimming of county infrastructure funds over a period of at least 2 years. Money that had been allocated for road repair, and the mill had been routed through false invoices to a business entity that Eliza did not immediately recognize. But the letter from Pell made the connection clear. The business entity was a shell, controlled jointly by Pell and by Silas Vane. The $4,400 in the canvas pouch was, as best Eliza could determine from the ledger, the last disbursement before the scheme had apparently been abandoned, possibly because the county roads commissioner had died unexpectedly in 1884. Possibly because someone had gotten nervous. The wagon, she guessed, had been used for the final transport and then disposed of, pushed into the creek on the edge of a property that Silas Vane would eventually come to own anyway, making it effectively invisible. She sat with all of this for a long time. Then she thought about her father, about the note he'd signed. The one Silas Vane claimed entitled him to the cooperage, the tools, the stacked barrels, the 30 years of work. About the fact that the original terms had apparently never been properly recorded. About Pell, who had drawn up those papers and who had also, apparently, helped route county funds into his own pocket. About how one man's convenient paperwork can take everything, and how another man's hidden records can give it back. She wrapped the documents carefully in a dry cloth from the workshop. She put the canvas pouch in the bottom of her carpet bag, under her spare dress. She went to find Aldous Burkett. Now, We want to be honest with you here, because this is the part of the story where things move fast, and it's easy to let the momentum carry you past the details that matter. Aldous Burkett was not just a farmer who needed his barrels rehooped. He was, as Eliza had not known when she first knocked on his gate, a former county commissioner, the predecessor to the man whose sudden death in 1884 had apparently given Silas Vane and Pell the cover they needed. Burkett had stepped down from the position 2 years prior due to his wife's illness, and he was not, as he told Eliza when she spread the documents on his kitchen table, entirely surprised by what he was reading. "I always wondered about the road funds," he said quietly. He had his reading glasses on, and he was moving through the ledger page with a patience that told Eliza he had understood figures like these before. "The mill account was off too. I raised questions before I left. Nobody wanted to hear them." "The letter has Pell's signature," Eliza said, "and the dates match the disbursements." "Yes, they do." Burkett took off his glasses and looked at her. "Where did you find this?" she told him. He listened without interrupting. "The wagon's been in that creek for 2 years," he said. "On land that Silas Vane just recently acquired." "Yes, and Silas Vane wants you off that land by Friday." "Yes." Aldous Burkett looked at the documents one more time. Then he stood up and got his coat from the hook by the door. "Let's go see Judge Harker," he said. "He's in town on Thursdays." It was a Thursday. We won't pretend the next several days were simple. They weren't. There were lawyers involved, and counterclaims, and a moment in Judge Harker's office when Silas Vane looked at Eliza across the room with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not calculation, but something that she recognized much later, when she had more experience with such things, as the look of a man who has built everything on ground that was never actually solid. "But we will tell you the outcomes, because they matter." The ledger and the bill of lading were submitted as evidence in a county fraud proceeding that Burkett helped initiate through the state commissioner's office. Aldrich Pell, faced with his own signature on the letter, negotiated a settlement that required him to withdraw from all legal and business activities in Colton's Bluff County. He left town before the summer was out and did not come back. Silas Vane's claim on Edmund Vane's cooperage was reviewed under the scrutiny that comes when other fraudulent dealings are being examined in the same courthouse. It turned out that Pell had drawn up the original note, the one Silas had used to seize the shop, and that the recording Pell claimed to have filed had in fact never been filed. The cooperage had been seized on the basis of a document that had no legal standing. Judge Harker ruled that the cooperage, the tools, and the barrels belonged to the estate of Edmund Vane. Edmund Vane had one heir. As for the gold coins, $4,400 of county funds that had been skimmed and hidden and submerged in a creek, that question went to the state commissioner's office along with the other evidence. The ruling took several months. In the end, as partial restitution to the county for the funds that could not be traced back to specific projects, the county accepted a portion. The remainder, $2,000, representing the portion the state could not directly attribute to diverted public funds, was returned to the finder. Eliza Vane walked out of that courthouse in September of 1887 with a deed to her father's cooperage in one hand and a bank receipt in the other. She was 22 years old. She had been sleeping on burlap sacks 4 months prior. She went straight to the cooperage. The lock Silas had put on the door was a better lock than the one her father had used. She cut it off with a pair of bolt cutters she'd borrowed from Aldous Burkett. Inside, everything was exactly as Silas had left it. The finished barrels along the south wall, her father's tools on their hooks, the smell of oak shavings and iron, and the particular combination of sawdust and oil that she had grown up inside of, and that hit her now in the chest like something physical, like something she had been holding her breath against for 5 months, and could finally release. She set her carpetbag down on the workbench. She opened it and took out the leather satchel, Thomas Birch's satchel, her father's satchel, hers now, and set the crow's plane on the bench where she could see it. She stood there for a while in the quiet of her father's shop. Then she picked up a barrel stave and got to work. By the following spring, Eliza Vane's cooperage had standing orders from 11 farms in Colton's Bluff County and 2 general stores in the next town over. She had hired a young woman named Letty as an apprentice. Not because Letty had asked, but because Eliza had seen her watching through the open cooperage door 3 mornings in a row and had finally just called out, "You want to learn or you just want to watch?" Letty had walked through the door without a word and picked up a mallet, and that was that. On the outside of the cooperage door, Eliza had hung a small sign. It read, E. Vane & Co., Cooper's. Below that, in smaller letters, she had painted a phrase that her father had used to say when people brought him warped staves or cracked heads that other shops had turned away. We work with what's worth saving. Aldous Burkett, walking past one afternoon, stopped to read the sign. He stood there for a moment, then he came inside. Your father would have liked that, he said. I know, she said. She didn't look up from the barrel she was working on, but she was smiling. And here at Fireside Stories, we've been thinking about Eliza ever since we first heard her story. About how she stood in front of that creek in the early morning dark, looking at a waterlogged wreck that everyone else had written off as part of the landscape. About how she didn't see junk, she saw wood, she saw potential. She saw something worth the effort of pulling up from the mud. Most of what gets discarded in this world isn't worthless, it's just inconvenient to look at closely. We'd like to ask you something before we go tonight. Not about wagons or cooperatives or creek beds specifically, but about something in your own life. What have you seen value in that everyone around you had already written off? It could be a skill, or a relationship, or a place, or a version of yourself that the world told you to stop believing in. Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and we'll be back soon with another story worth telling. Good night.